Welcome to today's webinar, the first in our series, Pathways to Success, Helping Students with College and Career Decisions. This first webinar is titled, It's All in Their Heads, Not in Their Brains, Neuroscience and Non-Traditional Careers, presented by Dr. Tara Ebersol. My name is Greg Nagy, and I am the Virtual Learning Community Manager from The Ohio State University, who provides technical support for the STEM Equity Pipeline project. Before we start the presentation, I'd like to go over some housekeeping items for this webinar. This webinar is scheduled to last roughly 1 hour and is being recorded in order to view the presentation in its entirety later. The recorded webinar will be available the next few days on the stemequitypipeline.org website. As you've already found out, you'll be watching the presenter present slides through the Adobe Connect interface while listening to them talk over your computer speakers. All the participants' microphones have been automatically muted. The presenters will answer questions after the presentation. However, we can take questions at any time. This is how we take questions. At any time during the presentation, you may submit a question by typing your question in the chat pod at the bottom right of the Adobe Connect window. We will read and respond to these questions at the end of the presentation. I would like to start the webinar by introducing Courtney Reed Jenkins, Director of Professional Development. Courtney? Courtney, you want to...
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the first in a 5-part webinar series entitled Pathways to Success, Helping Students with College and Career Decisions. Support for this webinar series came from the Minnesota State Colleges and Universities and the Minnesota Department of Education. They funded these webinars specifically to provide information to all of us who have a role in helping students understand successful paths to the high skills, high wage, and high demand jobs. On their behalf, I welcome you. Please ask questions. Use the chat function on the lower right-hand portion of your screen to engage Dr. Ebersol and others around the country in conversations about neuroscience and gender. I'd like now to introduce Dr. Ebersol. Dr. Ebersol is going to speak today on neuroscience, gender, and career preparation. She has been a professional educator for over 30 years as a teacher and as an administrator, and she currently serves as the administrator with the Community College of Baltimore County. She was the coordinator for the Center for Learning and Teaching Excellence, where she directed professional development activities ranging from small thematic gatherings to college-wide conferences. She created the college's first new faculty learning community that introduces new faculty to educational theory, teaching strategies, and classroom research. In addition, Dr. Ebersol spent several years as the CCBC's Learning Outcomes Associate, coordinating course-level assessment and helping lead the college to 2 national awards, the Council for Higher Education Accreditation 2006 Award for Institutional Progress and the 2008 Bellwether Award in Instructional Programs. Dr. Ebersol has published several articles on assessment and presented at numerous national conferences. She is currently Professor of Biology, co-chair of the Global Education Advisory Board, and the STEM liaison for the Community College of Baltimore County. Welcome, Dr. Ebersol.
Thank you, Courtney. I hope everyone can hear me. I am really thrilled to be here and to be able to discuss an area that is near and dear to my heart. I wanted just to give you a brief introduction to what has got me interested in neuroscience and the link to learning. About a decade ago, I had 3 very small children. I was in what I thought was the best of health, and sort of out of the blue, I suffered a hemorrhagic stroke. It was, as they believe, probably the result of an aneurysm. About 30% or a third of the people who had the kind of hemorrhage that I had don't even survive to make it to the hospital. Another third make it to the hospital but die there, and about a third of us are survivors. And what happened was they found an additional blood vessel tumor, and I went from neurologist to neurologist, and what I found was that there was virtually no agreement in any of the prognosis and diagnoses from any of these doctors. And so what I sort of introduce all of this with the caveat that we probably don't know as much about the brain as we should know and will know. So maybe there are things that I will present to you today that will change in just a few years with new information, but it's still a very exciting and emerging field, and I'm very much looking forward to showing this to you. Now, I do not have the power to change the PowerPoint, so I have, oh, good, thank you. So let's go to the next slide. I don't know how to do it because I don't have my little button. All right, so the first thing, this is actually a little easier to do if I have a face-to-face group, but I think that we can try to do this even online. And so what I want you to do is just think of a time when you learned to do something as an adult. And then think about how you learned it. So for example, at 40 years old, I decided to become a drummer in a rock band. And I took lessons and I practiced, and that's how I learned it. So think of something and just kind of mull it over in your heads. I'd love to know what they are, but I think it's easier just for you to think about it. Okay. All right. And Greg, are you on still?
Yes.
I don't have the arrows at the bottom that I had yesterday when we practiced. So I don't know how to
I'm gonna bump you up to a host in case that'll help.
Okay, thanks.
You have them now?
No, this time I have. Remember yesterday I didn't have the draw and the sharing and the full screen. I may have to just. This time I have those, but I don't have the arrows at the bottom that I had yesterday. So
Is there a way perhaps that you can slide your window down on the right-hand side maybe?
Let me try that.
This is Courtney, and I can advance it too for you.
Okay. Should I just say advance? Okay, go ahead and just move it forward then. We'll put all the options up there. Go ahead and do all of them. So maybe you learned by observing someone else, maybe you took a class, maybe you did some reading on your own. There are so many ways that we can learn as an adult. But what's really interesting is that if you get a group of adults together and you start to ask all of them how they learned, you will find that most, if not all, of their responses can fit into one of 6 categories. So we'll go ahead and take a look at these categories. So Courtney, if you don't mind. All right, so the first step is motivation. All of us found some reason why we learned what we learned. We were motivated by something, whether we wanted to be, to know what someone else knew. So for example, maybe it was you wanted to learn how to do an Excel spreadsheet when you needed it for your job. That was your motivation. Or maybe you wanted to learn to cook because that was something that was a survival skill. So there's a motivation. And then if we keep going through these stages, go ahead, Courtney, go to the next one. What generally happens is we begin to practice, and then we go to advanced practice. So we practice these skills. And in the beginning practice, some of that involves trial and error, and I think some of you may have even indicated that when you went through. How did I learn this? Well, I just tried it and made mistakes until I got it right. And then as we continue to advance in our learning, our practice becomes much more refined, as we say in stage 3. And as we go to stage 4, we begin to really begin to develop some skills. Now, it doesn't mean that we fully have mastered, but we have now some skills, and then we begin to refine those skills in stage 5. And then finally, in stage 6, we reach mastery, where we may even be in a position where we can teach someone else. Now, what's interesting about these 6 stages, I don't know how many of you may have some background in education, but they sort of connect or align with the stages of learning that Jean Piaget wrote about. If you remember all those theories that you may have had to learn about. And but he wrote about children. And I think for a long time we had this thought that children learn that way, but adults don't. And the reality is we all learn in exactly the same stages. It doesn't matter if we're old or if we're young. It doesn't matter if we're white or if we're black. And it doesn't matter if we are a male or a female. We all go through exactly the same stages. So now what I want to do is to show you what's going on in the brain while we're going through these 6 stages. And what we do is we actually construct physical structures in our brain as we learn new information. Some of you may have heard of this, but Einstein's brain was saved, and they find it to be significantly heavier than another person, normal person's brain. And so it suggests that there are additional structures in his brain. And you might think, well, he was just fortunate. He was born with a bigger brain than the rest of us. But they have found that he played the violin. And when they looked at the part of the brain that controlled the left hand, it was much larger than in a normal person. And he certainly wasn't born knowing how to play the violin. So we actually build structures as we learn. All right, let's take a look at the brain a little bit. Basically what we're going to do is we're going to learn, we learn by building, let's see, you know what I'm going to do, Courtney? Let's just go right to the next slide, and I'll explain this slide, but I will do it through the picture because I think it's much easier to learn from a picture. All right, now if you look at this picture, you see the types of cells that are in our brains. They're called neurons, and the ones, oh good, I've got a little arrow I think I can show you. Can you see my arrow? This section here is what most of you think of as a cell. There's the nucleus of the cell, and this is the cell body. And then sticking off of the cell are these projections. They look almost like the cell put its hand in an electric socket. And these things sticking out are called dendrites. And those dendrites are important in receiving information. And then extending from the cell is a long piece called the axon, and the axon is where we transmit information, and the axon ends in these little bulbs at the bottom, and those are just end bulbs, and they actually contain chemicals. So what happens is all along this neuron we have electrical impulses that carry the message from the dendrites to the end of the axons, and then at the end of the axons we have chemicals released which are called neurotransmitters that connect to the other dendrites and of the next neuron. So, and then the process starts all over again. So what we have again, we just have neurons are the cells of the brain. We have dendrites to receive information. We have axons to transmit the information. We don't have a physical connection between the neurons. We have a chemical connection between them. And so that kind of gives you an idea of what it looks like. Now, what we believe is happening is that as we learn, we create more connections between axons and dendrites. Now, whether we're actually growing more dendrites or whether we're just creating more synapses, we don't really know. But we believe that there are additional connections that are going on to the point that you can actually change the shape of your brain as you learn. All right, let's go ahead to the next slide. And we can keep going until we have those words up there. It turns out that the more you know, the larger your neural network is. So in other words, as you learn, you are growing these structures. I had a student a couple of semesters ago. He was an African-American male student, and he had a D in my class. And I told them about this process. And as he watched it, he said, "You mean I have those little worms in my brain?" And I said, "Yes, you have those worms in your brain." And he said, "Can I grow worms like that in my brain?" And I said, "Yes, you can grow them." I said, "It's a lot of work. It may be even a little painful, but you can definitely grow those worms in your brain." And what happened was he worked really hard to grow them, and by the end of the semester, he had a B+ in the class. So this is a very empowering piece of information for students to know that this happens. I'll sometimes begin a semester and say, I wish I were Mr. Spock and I could just do one of those mind melds and touch your brain and mine, and you'll know everything that's in my brain. But that's not possible, and the only way you're going to learn what's in my brain is for me to share it with you, but for you to grow the neurons so that you can hold on to that information. All right, let's look at the next slide. Now I want to mention these chemicals that we talked about that occur between the cells. Some of them you may already know about. You may have heard of dopamine. You may have heard of serotonin. That one has a lot of people know about it because people who may have not enough serotonin tend to be depressed. But I think all of these are important to mention. First of all, both glutamate and dopamine are pleasurable neurotransmitters. And one of the things that happens as we get older is the level drops. In fact, it drops very rapidly in our teen years. So we go from being a happy-go-lucky child, and then suddenly our levels of glutamate and dopamine sort of drop in half, and they begin to fluctuate. And so our teenagers may be exhibiting signs of depression. It may not be that they are going to stay there. Many of them will balance out over time. And of course, we do adjust. We do begin to accept and be able to cope with these lower amounts. For most of us do. Some of us can't, and we do need to have some additional medication to help us. The one I want to draw your attention to is adrenaline. This is involved in attention and mental focus. But if it is overproduced in the brain, we actually produce it as a hormone as well as a neurotransmitter, and it's a stress hormone. And if it becomes overproduced, it can flood the connections between the neurons, which would make learning and focus almost impossible. So if you have a student in your class who is being beaten up at home, who is homeless, who has not been able to eat for days, who has lost their job, their ability to learn is probably significantly reduced because they have all of this adrenaline. They can't focus. I had a student a number of years ago, very good nursing student, but in a biology class, and she had had her brother killed in a drive-by shooting, and I just recommended her take a break and come back and take the course in the next semester, which she did, and she did really well, but she couldn't focus under the circumstances. All right, so let's go on to the next slide. And we do need to talk a little bit about hormones, because I think a lot of things are blamed on hormones that shouldn't be blamed, and a lot of things happen that are because of hormones. And we do have receptors all over our brains for hormones, and our hormones do affect and work in tangent with neurotransmitters, and some are even produced in the brain. One example is melatonin. You may have heard of that one. That is one that helps prepare us for sleep. And one of the things that has been discovered is that our adolescents produce melatonin at a much later time than children or adults do. And this may become significant for those of you who are teaching college, because if you're running an 8 o'clock class, you may have students there who are really not physically alert. They have gone to sleep at a much, much later time, and they can't go to sleep earlier. It's easy to say, go to sleep at 10 and you can get up at 6. Everybody can do that. But if this hormone is produced that late, they may not be able to. What I think is interesting about it is that there really is an evolutionary biological reason for why it's produced later. We don't know for sure, but some of the biologists believe that the problem is that back in the caveman times, you needed someone to take care of the tribe in the middle of the night, and so you would put your strongest out there, which were your teenagers, and if they fell asleep, they got killed by the other tribe or they got eaten by the lions, and if they stayed awake, then they went on to have babies who also could stay awake through their teen years. The other hormones to talk about, of course, are the reproductive hormones, the estrogen and progesterone in females and testosterone in males. A lot of things get blamed on them, and they do become much more abundant in the adolescent and late adolescent years. They are primarily involved, however, in helping the body prepare for reproduction. They're really not involved in learning. The only other time that it becomes significant is that when a fetus is in the mother's womb, if it is a male fetus, it will overproduce testosterone to protect it from the female's estrogens. And if that message gets mixed up, there are impacts on the newborn child. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later. Okay, next. One person I want to point out to you is Dr. Rita Smilkstein. I got a lot of information from her. Some of this also comes from a book called The Primal Teen by Barbara Strauch, and another important source is Pink Brain, Blue Brain by Lise Elliott. But the reason I want to point her out is that I believe she was quite a pioneer. She was the first one to talk about the learning process as being a physiological process, and she dealt with very angry, old-fashioned neurologists really beating her down, and she just kept on saying it until they found that what she was saying was valid. So I just wanted to point that out to you. All right, next. Okay, so what are some other things about the brain? First of all, learning is a very natural process. Our brains are programmed to learn. We are innately logical. We are innately able to solve problems. We are innate in our ability to seek patterns, and we do have internal motivation. What's really neat is that when we learn, we feel pleasure. I'm sure all of you at some point in time have worked on solving a problem, and when it finally makes sense to you, you have this wonderful aha moment. It's like the light bulb has gone off. It is this incredibly pleasurable moment. Well, what you have actually done is created a pathway, a connection in your brain, and it is a feel-good moment. Okay, next. This is going to take me a couple of minutes. I'm not going to focus too much on this slide. You can read this one on your own. But I think one of the things that's important is that all of the things that we're learning about the brain suggest ways to teach that are different than the way we used to teach. So for example, we used to think that if we stood and lectured for 3 hours, we were transmitting information to our students. Some studies are suggesting that in terms of our ability to pay attention to a monologue, which you're kind of doing right now with me, but you basically get 10 minutes, maybe 8.5 minutes, about the time between commercial breaks. So, you know, you could say, oh, I just gave a 3-hour lecture and you had your students for about 10 minutes. So that kind of attitude really has to be changed in light of what we now know about this physical process. We now know that the brain structures work better when students are actively engaged. We know the process takes time. That part makes me a little sad because our semesters are designed to be 14 weeks. And so sometimes you'll have a student who may not be able to master, for example, a math course in 14 weeks, and they come out of it feeling as though I can't do math. Well, it's not that they can't do it. They just can't do it in 14 weeks. They might need more time to grow the structures. So I think that this piece of it really does go against sort of our overall learning environments. One other thing to point out is that these networks can't grow from nothing. You can't just expect students to jump into an organic chemistry class if they don't have the background already. They have to grow these structures on structures that already exist. So one of the best ways to deal with that is through contextual learning, whereby the students have some kind of context in which to grow the new knowledge. And that's kind of a constructivist approach, and I think there's some real validity to it based on what we now know about the brain learning. We also know that that it's pleasant, and we've already said that. So those are just some changes. You can read over the details. Feel free to ask me questions, you know, if you have about this part of it. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So as we grow specific neural networks for each one, oftentimes you will say, aha, I feel as though I'm getting it. But what you really could say is, I feel my neural networks are growing. So this is another way to look at it. All right, next slide. All right, so the rules. Here are the rules. Neural networks grow off what are already there. Networks grow from what is actively, personally, and specifically experienced and practiced. And it's the specificity is important because we have this thought, well, you know, if you're already a gymnast, obviously you can be a springboard diver, but there are some differences. There may be already some neural networks there, but you really have to specifically focus on what it is you're learning. And the reality of it is if you don't use that information, it will be pruned. It just gets pruned away. So those of us who are angry because we don't remember something we learned all those years ago, it's because you didn't need it and you weren't using it, and so it is gone. Stimulation is very important, and then of course the last part, which is emotions affect learning, we've kind of touched on already. Okay, next slide. So certainly we could spend an hour talking about nurture versus nature, and we could spend hours talking about it without an answer. But in terms of what we've been doing so far and discussing so far, the plasticity, our brains are plastic. In other words, we can change their shape. So although we may be born with a certain amount of neural circuits, they are not fixed at birth. We can develop and grow them, and we can grow them in any direction we want. Now, it's true that some directions are easier for us than others. Some of them we already have the background for. So there is a little bit of aptitude involved in terms of the speed. I definitely wanted to learn to sing. I wanted to not only play the drums in the band, I wanted to be a singer. So I took voice lessons. I have practiced and practiced and practiced, and I'm still never going to be a lead singer. I just don't have the vocal cords for it. But I got a whole lot better at singing by doing what I did. So it doesn't mean you're going to necessarily, like it's a 100% chance if you want to go to the Olympics in gymnastics, so I'm just going to practice and I can do it. That's not what we're saying. What we are saying is that you can grow and you can develop and you can learn in any direction. And I think this pruning part is kind of important because what we have found in teenagers is that the prefrontal cortices of their brains, which is where judgment and decision-making is, becomes really enlarged throughout the teenage years. They kind of really have alien-looking brains. Those of us who have had teenage children know that an alien takes over our children's bodies in teenage years. The alien brain really does sort of exist. It's way, way too big. And what is in this brain are so many neural pathways. It's almost like a weedy garden. It's so overgrown. And so the pruning part is really important. We need to be able to focus on what we need to be able to focus on. And over time, as these teenagers begin to make decisions and slowly develop into adults, they're going to find that their pathways become more and more clear, more and more developed, more and more mature. And so one of the things that seem to contribute to this process of pruning is to provide opportunities for students to practice and also to have socialized learning. They seem to be able to accomplish these goals better and have an easier time developing these neural networks when they have some social learning involved. All right. So let's go to the next slide. In the next slide, we're going to now move into gender differences. So you can go ahead. It's all right. You can go to the next one. That was just sort of a topical thing. So you can go ahead, Courtney, to the next one. Basically, everything we've talked about so far has been true regardless of your age, your gender, your race, your class. It doesn't matter. We all learn the same way. So given that information, why don't we have women in STEM at a level that we have males? Why aren't women making those decisions? So are there gender differences, and how do they grow, and is there anything a teacher can do to minimize them? All right, so let's keep going. What we have now is a series of statements that are true and false. And you know what? I'm going to go ahead, Courtney. I was originally going to do these one at a time with you because I wanted it's going to be kind of a long thing. It's much more fun, I think, in person because you get to say whether you think it's true or false, and then we open it up to discussion. But I'm just going to kind of go through them and just tell you that if you read the first two, and you could probably tell me what you think is whether it's true. Newborn girls are instinctively more social than boys. Newborn boys are instinctively more object-oriented than girls. And through a meta-analysis of many, many studies, the answer to that question is false. They are not. However, when we get to the third statement, girls begin talking about 1 month earlier than boys. That statement is true. It turns out that there is a physiological difference in terms of maturity rates. In the fourth one, that's a trick question. It says 2-year-old boys are twice as likely to exhibit physical aggression, such as biting, hitting, kicking, as toddler-aged girls. And the answer is false. However, 2-year-old boys are slightly more likely to exhibit physical aggression, just not twice as likely. You might, maybe 25% as likely. So you do see a little more physical aggression in toddler boys. Preschool age boys cry less than girls, and the answer to that question is false. We don't see a reduction in male crying until much later in their age, and it does probably relate to socialization. Spatial skills like mental rotation exhibit the largest of any cognitive sex difference, and I'm just going to tell you outright that's true, and we're going to spend some time on that. The PISA exam, the Program of International Student Assessment Exam, we have two true and falses. Girls perform better than boys in reading in every country that participates, and boys perform better than girls in math in every country that participates. And what we have found is that the former is true, but the latter is false. There are a couple of countries in which girls perform better in math than boys. But for the most part, those are true statements. And the last one, boys have larger brains on average than girls, that one is true. I got a whole bunch more of these because we're going to get through them. Let's go ahead to the next slide and take a look at those. Thanks, Courtney. All right, gender differences in the brain demonstrate that behavioral gender differences are hardwired. What would you think about that one? And the answer is false. There just seems to be no evidence of hardwiring for behavioral gender differences. Prenatal testosterone, remember we talked about hormones prior to birth and then again in their adolescent years. Prenatal testosterone does influence children's toy preference. There have been a number of studies that have shown across the world that boys seem to be more attracted to sort of gadgets and wheelies, and that girls seem to be more attracted to dolls. So this is something that does seem to be hardwired. Prenatal testosterone, however, does not affect verbal ability. What about rising levels of estrogen at puberty? Does that enhance girls' verbal skills? We know they're better verbally at those ages, and it has nothing to do with estrogen. As I said, estrogen in the adolescent years is involved in preparing us for reproduction. Certainly your girls are probably more interested in the boys in your class or the males in your class than they perhaps are in you, but they are not more verbal as a result of it. Likewise, the rising levels of testosterone are not the reason why boys have better spatial and math abilities. The next one, the rising levels of puberty elevate boys and girls' sex drive. That one's true. All right, so the next one, mothers talk more to their young daughters than their young sons. That one is true. When boys are successful in school, their parents and teachers are likelier to attribute their success to hard work. And when girls are successful, adults are likelier to attribute it to innate talent. That one is false. It's backwards. Girls are given credit because they work hard. They don't really have the abilities. They just work hard at it. And boys are they're attributed to the fact that they're just innately capable. Risk-taking is discouraged more in daughters than sons by parents. So I think what we're seeing, and we're going to go into the sort of the summary, and Courtney, if you would kind of progress us here, I'm going to show you some of the summaries of what we've been talking about. Okay, so what we see is that there are virtually no differences in infancy. There's a little bit of a maturation difference, and there is a sort of a toy or an interest difference between males and females. But these differences begin to increase through childhood and adolescence, which suggests cultural and social reasons. We really are still debating which of these differences are innate and which ones are nurture. But there have been some books out there, like I think Men Are From Mars and Women Are From Venus. They really exaggerate differences that studies do not support. Although the psychological differences tell us there may be differences in brain structure or function, the reality of it is that if we look at the brains of males and females, we see virtually no difference at all. So let's go ahead to the next slide. Wonderful. So the brain differences, there are small differences in the brain, but they are not categorical. In other words, they're not major differences. There are some sex differences also, but these are very small also. Although boys and girls may have different interests, or males and females may have different interests, they do not learn differently. And the one thing I want to point out about that is that I have 2 daughters and a son. And my 2 daughters have very different interests. So even though they're both girls, I think interest to some extent is based on just who we are. And but overall the studies are suggesting that there are some gender links between interests. How they learn, exactly the way we've already talked about. They have neurons, the neurons grow, they grow through practice, all of that stays the same. The fact that girls are getting better and better in math and science and athletics prove that their abilities are malleable. In other words, we can change the brain. It is plastic. We can grow, we can develop, we can change. We are also finding that earlier spatial skill training can help girls transition from high school to college math and science. We're going to talk more about that, so if that doesn't make sense to you, just hang in there. And then the last one is that truly the biggest hurdle for getting more women into STEM careers remains cultural, not neurological. Okay. This one I just wanted to show you. These are EEGs, and they are to show you the differences between males and females really throughout their lives. So you think, oh, well, the differences get bigger as they get older. And I think you can see the girls are the solid, represent the solid line. The boys are represent the dotted lines. And you can see that really gender differences in terms of the brain don't change over time, not significantly at any rate. All right, thanks. Next one. So I keep telling you we're going to talk about spatial skills. Here we go. Let's talk about them. The thing about the spatial skills is that because little boys' interests are different, they begin at an early age building Legos, building rockets, building model cars, and so by doing that they continually create these spatial abilities in their brains. And these spatial skills are really important in science and engineering, so they're kind of getting a head start in a very early years. So maybe there's some innate aptitude, certainly there's innate interest, but then by the time you add all of the experience, you create a pretty large gap. I'm not going to say large gap, but you create a gap between males and females in spatial skills. And here's another, if this area interests you at all, here's a resource for you. But we're going to keep going with some more information on spatial skills. Let's go ahead and take the next slide. All right, so here's one. Give it a shot on your own. Give it a try. Whoops. We gave out the answer. First of all, the idea is that on your own to draw this 2D pattern, in other words, a two-dimensional pattern piece from the sleeve of the man's coat. And what you'll find is some students can just look at it and they can do it. And that's because their spatial skills are more refined and more developed than people who can't. So the answer is on the next slide. So I don't know if any of you are sitting there trying to draw, but here's what it would look like. And so the idea is if you have strong spatial skills, you would be able to do this. And what's kind of neat about this, I've done a lot of sewing in the past, so I didn't have any trouble doing that. They suggest that there is, sewing is something that women tend to have an interest in, but the skills are the same. So this may be a way to help females with their spatial skills. Anyway, okay, let's go on. That's just a thought. Next one. Okay, so here we go. Here's a sample of a mental rotation question. So if you were to see or test your students, you might show them something like this. That here is a block, and we are going to rotate it. And you can see that on the top. So then how does that compare to the rotation of the next one down? I'm going to give you all a second or two to see if you would pick A, B, C, D, or E as a rotation that matches the top rotation. All right, Courtney, let's give him the answer. Did you get D? Anyway, this is just a way to test abilities and to see where students are. This is a skill that's important in engineering. All right, next. It's not the next slide. We have a little more on this slide to go. This is one of the reasons that boys tend to be better. They do use Legos. We can help children at a very early age by encouraging this in all children. We can even do it, however, in adults. It's not that only children can learn spatial skills. So next slide will help us along with that. I think this slide tells it all. I think this kind of pulls together everything that we've been talking about so far. It says we can learn. All of us can learn, whether we're males or females. The line that has the little circles on it represents males who performed well in a spatial skills test. The one with the squares represents the females who scored well on the spatial test. And the one with the triangles represents women who scored poorly on the spatial skills test. And then what happened is they were all given time to practice and opportunities to practice. And what they found after several weeks of this, believe it was an actual course that they took, they tested them again, and they found that all the students had improved their spatial skills through practice. Just like you got better at practice by for learning to drive or learning to cook or any of those things that you said in the very first slide. How did you get better at it? You practiced it. You wanted to be a swimmer, you practiced it. You wanted to run a triathlon, you practiced it. There's no difference. They just practiced and they got better at it. And it didn't matter whether they had innate ability to start with or not, they got better. And you can see the biggest improvement actually was among the women who scored the lowest. So this is something that can be taught, and it's something that can be encouraged even in the college years, because even as adults we can improve in this area. All right, so we're going to move on to the next slide, which is my last one. We have a reference slide too, but I just want to tell you a little story here before I close out and start to answer some of your questions. I told you I became a drummer, sort of a middle-aged drummer. And actually among middle-aged female drummers, I'm probably pretty decent. But I had a situation where I was performing, and an elderly gentleman came up to me and he said, "I really like the way you play the drums." He said, "But you don't play the drums like the young boys do. You play you're very choreographed, and you are you play in it with a very different style. You don't try to be loud and try to overcome the band." And I left with sort of mixed feelings. I was honored that he would say that, but then I thought, why don't I play like the boys? Is it because I'm middle-aged? Is it because I'm a female? Or is it because maybe I just prefer to play a very choreographed, gentle drum rhythm? And the bottom line is, it really doesn't matter. The reality is I could learn to play the drums because that's what I wanted to learn, and I used the same process that all of us learn to learn anything. And so I'm going to leave you here with a quote before we open it up to questions. This is I have lots of quotes that I love, but I thought this was really a beautiful quote by Emily Dickinson, which is, "The brain is wider than the sky, for put them side by side, the one with the other will contain, with ease, and you beside." I want to thank you, and I'm hoping we still have 15 minutes, and I wanted to open that up to questions that you may have.
Thank you, Dr. Ebersol. I always appreciate hearing your thoughtful distillation of the research and specifically how it affects us in education as we do our jobs, particularly around recruiting and retaining students into non-traditional careers. I am encouraging people to use the chat function to submit questions to Dr. Ebersol, and I will read those to Dr. Ebersol. We have several people typing and it's not popping up yet, so I'm going to give it a minute.
All right, that's great. Thanks, Courtney.
So one of the questions submitted is, do you think that the brain of students who are considered at risk learn differently?
My answer to that is based on the research that exists, is that the process of learning is exactly the same. The difference is going to be that the at-risk student is more likely under stress. They may be dealing with emotional issues, and we know for a fact that stress creates this sort of flooding of the brain and makes it much more challenging for these students to stay focused and to stay on task. It's almost as though we have to go back and resolve the stress issue before we can really help them learn, although simultaneously as they learn, oftentimes their stress is reduced. So it's not that the process is different, but that the process is slowed down because of these external variables.
Thank you. We have multiple folks typing in, and the questions haven't quite caught up with our system. So one of the questions is, can you tell us more about boys' brains being larger? You did say that is true,
It
right?
is true. When it was first discovered in the 1800s, it was used as a way to say that males are the sort of the superior sex over females. But one of the things about human beings, I'm going to throw out a biological term for you, but we are referred to as a dimorphic species, which means that our genders are not the same size. You can see animal species that are out there which are not dimorphic. In other words, the males and females of the species are the same size, but we are not. And a bigger brain is required to help control a larger creature. So one of the things to help you understand that is that they have found the skulls of Neanderthal men. Neanderthal men were very large hominid species that died out maybe about 10,000 years ago. These skull cases are much larger than ours. So you might think, oh, well, they're just so much smarter than we are. But the larger brain was necessary for the larger musculature, just simply to help keep the larger body going. So it really isn't related so much to learning. Learning is the same, male or female. A larger person is just going to have a larger brain.
Thank you. Another question is, do you have suggestions for adults to practice their spatial visualization skills? In other words, the alternative to adult Legos.
You know, that's a really good question. I should probably, you know what, Courtney, we have a website where people can take the rotation test. There are courses out there. In fact, the institution where I'm teaching, we are looking for a grant to help us adopt the spatial rotation course, to add it into our sort of, a lot of you have it, it's like an Achieving Student Success course, so we will actually just incorporate it in there. But the other thing is we sort of assume that adults are very different from children and they don't like any of the same things. But one of the things we've been sort of experimenting with is putting out pipe cleaners, you know, so that while we do our presentations and while we do professional development, the audience can kind of use their hands and create things and build things. You could probably do the same thing with blocks, and you would find that they would be having a great time. So there are ways that we can do that. But I think the best way is to link you to this website, and I'm thinking that, Courtney, maybe we should find a way to link that to either this webinar or just to the NAEP site.
We will do that. When we post the webinar, we post all webinars as archived webinars on our website, and we will include the
Okay,
link.
great. Thank you.
The other thing that I'll say, this is not an endorsement, but I found a game called IQ Twist in a toy store the other day that my family is having tremendous fun playing with around visual spatialization.
It's wonderful. I think we just assume that adults...
So another
sorry.
question, Dr.
I was just saying, I think we assume that adults don't like to do what children like to do, and they do like it. So anyway, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yes, it's a fun game. So another question is, how does ADHD and dyslexia impact learning neurologically? Are there strategies to help those students?
I think both of those are really complex, and it would take a lot to go through what's going on. I can tell you, though, that they are having, how do I describe it? Their pathways are not the same as the pathways in someone who does not have those. So we don't know exactly what it is. Is it that there's less myelin so that the neurons are not as protected, and that they're firing more frequently, or whether they're firing backwards? I mean, there are definitely things that can go wrong in the brain. After my hemorrhage, I struggled for years with a mild seizure disorder and had to be put on anti-epileptic medications. My brain was simply on overdrive. It had some kind of scar tissue, and it just, every once in a while, it would fire out of control. People who have ADHD, their brains are not firing correctly. It's almost like they're overfiring. So what needs to be done for them is to help them focus. One of the best things to do is to break down what they have to do into very small tasks so that they can stay focused and reduce all of that sort of over-triggering that's going on in the brain. And I mean, I may not be describing it correctly. As I said, I think there's a lot we don't know yet about the causes of ADHD and the causes of dyslexia and many of these other learning disabilities, and we're going to learn more about them as time goes on. But what I have read about ADHD is that breaking down into smaller tasks is the best way to help someone with those problems. I don't know a lot about dyslexia and the best way to help those students. I think there are techniques that help them, but I think they may be better off with someone who has training specifically to deal with that. But your question about do they learn through practice and do they create neural networks, that is true, but there is sort of almost like a malfunction going on in the brain.
Thank you. There is one additional comment that I'd like to share. My conclusions are that interests in learning are from exposure, practice, and training. When we work with students, we should be keeping in mind their physical brain development and should create environment for that plasticity or flexibility to change and grow.
Right.
Does that align with your thinking?
Absolutely. That's a beautiful statement. I think that's exactly right.
It is. Yes. Well, thank you, Dr. Ebersole. Thank you also to the Minnesota Department of Education and the Minnesota State Colleges and Universities for providing funding for this project. I hope that you can join us for the remaining webinars in the 5-part series. We have a webinar on January 8th called Females in STEM Classes and Programs of Study, Teacher Strategies to Recruit and Transition Female Students into STEM Careers. We have another webinar on February 5th called Males in Health Occupation Programs of Study, another on March 12th that will focus on partnering with parents and families, and our final webinar on April 9th is partnering with business and industry and community organizations. In addition, we invite you to join a virtual community of educators, community members, business and industry representatives, and other stakeholders. And you can find resources, information, and invitations to online and face-to-face professional development at napeequity.org. And we have just posted the survey web link for this webinar, and we invite, entreat people to please fill out the survey so that we can provide professional development via technology that specifically meets your needs as educators around the country. Thank you so much for spending the last hour with us, and have a good afternoon.
This is Greg. I just want to remind everyone about the archive will be available on the STEMequitypipeline.org website, and that should be available starting tomorrow, along with the slides and the link that Dr. Ebersole mentioned. I'll include that. And as Courtney said, we have the survey should automatically have popped up on your web browser. If it didn't, you can click on it here and click the Browse To button. If you don't have time right now, I will also be sending this in an email with the link. And then if you're listening to this as an archived webinar, please refer back to your registration email with the link survey. Thank you, everyone. This is the end of the webinar.